I can't quite remember how Wolf and Karl connected, but it had to do with Karl's writing or his music. And this was early when Karl was recording and writing, and he did we called them albums then, you call them CDs now, called Living at the End of Time. And Karl's work is fairly thoughtful and philosophical and reflective on the world. And Wolf really liked his worldview and liked the idea that he executed it through music. And so he would invite Karl to come up when he did his training sessions to do music for the training sessions. And that went on for a couple of years. And then they continued to correspond. Tips was a newsletter that Wolf generated when he was at Syracuse, and I would say it was during the 80s, and maybe mid to the mid-90s, and it would come out periodically. The subscription fee was $25 a year, and it would come out irregularly, I think, but maybe almost every other month or every third month, and it was about 25, 30 pages or more, double-sided, Xeroxed, or maybe even, what's that old method of mimeograph, maybe? And each page would have 8 to 10 items on it, and they would be little snippets of things going on in the world, many things that substantiated his worldview, his theories. And they were exhaustive to read, and I always felt my husband must have the only subscription, or if not the only subscription, the only person to actually read every page of the edition. Well, Wolf and normalization is a huge thing in my professional life. It's very big. In 1971, when I first got into the field, I got into the field sort of accidentally. I was living in Scranton, dating my husband, and we got married, and I was studying music in college. And while I was going to college, I would see these other college students at the University of Scranton walking around town with children who had disabilities, and at some subconscious level was really drawn to that and what they were doing. And so when I finished college and was married in December, I walked right into the institution that I knew those students had worked at to work. And I worked there for a year, and Karl joined me in the middle of 1971, working in this small institution with kids. And we were very disturbed by it. It wasn't a bad institution. It was in the middle of Scranton. It was in the middle of the city, so the kids were out all the time. And we didn't really witness any abuse in the city operation. We did in the country operation. But I remember working with the children, teaching music to them, and saying to my husband, I can't be a teacher when what they're looking for is a mother. And it was so obvious to me that that was a need. And so my husband and I kind of, after he joined me, dissatisfied with this arrangement, in our own heads wanted something different and invented the idea of maybe being like a group home, but we didn't have a name for it. We wanted to be in a house and take care of kids. And so we searched and searched, and we ended up in the Philadelphia area working in 1972 in another small institution of an agency that really wanted to do this. And Pennsylvania, an early adapter of community services, having hired a man named Mel Knowlton, whom I later learned worked for and with Wolfensberger in Encore, Nebraska. So Pennsylvania recruited Mel Knowlton to Pennsylvania to start something called community services. And in those early days in 1972, Mel and the state thought they should teach people something. And so they had these week-long seminars for people who were going to be house parents. And back then, house parents meant man, woman, married. I mean, it was now anybody, but back then the idea was that you lived in and you were kind of like parents. And so they would have these, Mel Knowlton sponsored these training sessions around the state. It was a week, and it was all couples who were intending to be house parents because the General Assembly in Pennsylvania was getting ready to fund community group homes. So this was the ramp up. So we went to this session, and every couple got a copy of Normalization. Every couple got a copy of Normalization. By then, we were now at least 2 or 2.5 years into working in these little institutions, private institutions. And we knew things weren't right. In the second institution we lived in at the time, it was in the country, and we were always trying to take the kids into town and took kids home with us. And the week-long conference was about community services, and it was conceptual and philosophical. And I don't think anybody ever talked about Wolf's book, but a number of people there were protégés, I believe. So we went home, and I cracked the book. And it was like the light shone on my reality, because Wolf gave words to the things that my husband and I instinctively knew and understood. He labeled it, he described it, and he explained why what we felt was true. And we felt so enormously validated and charged that I would say it was like the rocket launch for my career. I mean, understanding and believing what was possible, what was right, and what made sense. So that book, and Wolf played a big role in my life. I never saw Wolf until much later in my career. Actually, when I was the state director of Pennsylvania, I brought Wolf in to speak. We were running a leadership institute, and there were only ever 30 people in this leadership institute, and they would meet over months. And they all wanted to meet Wolf Wolfensberger. There were a lot of agency directors and senior level managers, and they wanted to meet Wolf. And so we asked Wolf to come in with John McKnight, of all people. And the two of them spent a day and a half with these leaders talking about the future. And that was really the first time I'd met Wolf, which was a good 35 years later. The Wolfensberger and John McKnight event was probably in the mid-90s sometime, and or the late 90s. And they both spoke extemporaneously to the 30 people in the Leadership Institute. And John was ever optimistic and positive and oriented to the community and possibilities, and Wolf was about as negative as I could imagine him to be, basically saying it's all going to hell in a handbasket and it's hopeless. And one of the participants, Joe Bucci, who was the executive director of a provider agency, asked Wolf, then why do you come to things like this? And Wolf was unflappable, and he said to speak the truth. And that was it. Normalization itself, there are a couple of elements in normalization. One was the myths about what was then called mental retardation, God's special children, I can't remember. I used to know them like you'd know the Ten Commandments, but I don't remember them anymore. But God's special children, or the converse was the devil. And when he described those myths, it just rang true and helped me understand that over the ages, people had labeled people in these negative contexts for good or bad, but no matter what those myths were, what the labels were, it was other. Not like me, not human. And so that kind of both helped me understand the danger of these assumptions and gave me words to describe to people why the assumptions were problematic and they should think differently. The other thing in normalization that really struck me powerfully to this day is the role of ideology in our world and our thinking. And people think, I think, that ideology is an esoteric concept and it doesn't belong in the everyday world. But he made very clear early on in the text that if you think you don't have an ideology, you actually do, and it's subconscious and therefore very dangerous. And so it would be important to understand what the idea was behind what you were doing, and to be thoughtful about what that idea was. And then the third element to normalization, which made such immense sense, was that his definition of normalization, that is that people having access to culturally normative activities, routines, and rhythms and situations promoted culturally normative behavior, and that very often that when people weren't culturally normative or they weren't like everybody else, it had a lot to do with their environment. And to this very day, when I talk to people who don't know a lot about the field or the dangers of a negative ideology, and I describe, still, I'm afraid we're still describing why institutional living isn't a good idea. I use his definition and then usually try to illustrate it by saying things like, when I got in the field and people moved out of institutions and didn't know how to use hot and cold running water, and we thought that was evidence of their disability, it turned out it was because they never had access to cold and hot water faucets. And that being deprived, a normative experience actually deprived them of learning skills that really would be naturally learned. And so, as I said, the book was foundational, created a framework for how to think about people's both rights and what opportunity provided people, and gave us words to use. One big one is just social behaviors. Hello, please, thank you. When you're living in an environment that doesn't have those basic social courtesies built into the rhythms and routines, we all learn to say please and thank you at home. If please and thank you isn't in the social routine, you're not going to pick it up. If eating your food fast, because that's the only way you could get it before it was stolen, you develop the behavior of gorging food quickly in order to protect your supply of food. And so all those, just the way of addressing, if everybody around you doesn't care how you look, you don't come to care how you look. So you don't pay attention to whether your hair is combed or whether you have breakfast on your face, because it doesn't matter to anybody around you, so you don't develop the consciousness of that, so that when you're in society, you are like everyone else. And often there were discussions and debates about this culturally normative people, and were we making people be normal? Were we denying who they were? And that's a complex concept, and there is some legitimacy to deliberating that. But I don't think that's what he meant. And I think that when being yourself, however that is the consequence of having been in a deficient environment where you were denied typical experiences, then that's not being yourself and who you are. That's really being the product of a deficient environment. And so, and what's problematic with that is it creates a barrier between you and everybody else, and so it interrupts relationships. So, right after reading Normalization, my husband and I opened a group home with 6 kids. We're very conscious of what they wore to school. Not all 6 hanging on the front yard yelling and screaming, but and carrying on like kids might do, but understanding that they had this sort of extra burden where people expected them not to act like everybody else. So if they were acting like the worst of everybody else, it was really multiplied. The other concept in normalization that I think about all the time is his concept of deviancy juxtaposition. And that when people are perceived as deviant in the society, simply meaning you deviate from what people see as the norm, neutral about whether the norm is good or bad, but you're not like the norm, that there will be a barrier and you will be not accepted or adopted by the norm. And that if there is a deviancy in some characteristic and you collect lots of people with that same perceived deviancy, it multiplies the impact of it. And I think about it to this day. And so, I remember being in Italy and coming out of the the Duomo in Florence, and sure enough, there was a busload of Americans all over 65 with gray hair, all with sweatpants on and sneakers, and I thought, there it goes, deviancy, juxtaposition. It plays out in life all the time, and that the collecting any like people together creates characteristics that don't always build on the positives, but kind of can draw to the negative. So a large group of lawyers moving around has an aspect of deviance from the norm that makes people suspicious or cautious or whatever. So I thought that was a very interesting concept and has ramifications in life. Wolf's book, Normalization, is not accessible to everyone. It's pretty intellectual, and not everyone can necessarily translate the lessons or the principles into real life. But if you can do that for other people, if you could translate it into concrete experiences in the moment, it's enormously powerful and just self-evident. So when my husband and I were house parents, and I have to say, what he did for us was he labeled our instincts. I mean, I guess I learned things from the book, but it was such an immediate connection to it. I often feel like he pulled out stuff inside of me that I knew but didn't know I knew. But this was the early 70s, 1971, 2, 3, 4, and in that period of time, my husband and I were immersed with other baby boomers, just got out of college, didn't worry about money, we're going to change the world. A lot of us Peace Corps rejects, Vista rejects, or alternative to Vista. And so we were really immersed with a lot of coworkers in the one institution I worked with. And then when we opened our group home, we got to hire, so you screened out people who didn't get it. But among the people I work with, which were significantly new graduates out of college with the sensibilities of the 60s, people got it. It made sense. I never met anybody who said, no, this is contrary to what I think is true or real. I just think that translating in a common experience, not denying people exposure to the book and the terms and that, but translating the terms, it was very accessible to people and helped them understand, and it clicked. In the early 70s, when we first got into the field, this is 1971 is before the right to education. Now, I worked in Pennsylvania, and the right to education was 1972, predated the federal statute by 4 years. But at that point, families were all still being told to put people in institutions. Kids weren't in school. I had my only exposure to people with disabilities was in grade school and high school, and they were literally in both environments, the class in the basement, one class in the basement, literally with carpet looms, I mean, really stigmatized. And so I'd never seen very many people, and certainly the kids that were in these two classrooms were very mildly disabled. I mean, not people with significant disabilities. And people were hidden. And so when you went out in the community with people with disabilities, you did get a lot of stares. And there was a lot of negative feedback, and communities were insanely oppositional to anything that looked like a group home. It was really pioneering and pushing the envelope. Today, 2011, most everybody you meet has been exposed to disability. Either a son or daughter or a grandson has a kid and they've been diagnosed, or somebody's worked in a group home, or they work in a medical practice. But I hardly meet anyone now that hasn't had a personal experience with people with disabilities. And so it's very different. The world has become educated just because people are present and not sent away anymore. And Wolf talked about that, I think. That he didn't use NIMBY, not in my backyard, but I think that our effort in the early years to open group homes for 6 and sometimes 8 and 10 people, we'd forgotten the concept of deviancy juxtaposition. And so it wasn't culturally normative for 6 and 8 people with disabilities to all live grouped together in a house. And the fact that communities had a little difficulty with that, I think to some extent was because the concept didn't fit into community. And we're now learning at this very conference that size matters in people's experience. The size of the home people live in matters in terms of their experience, the quality of their life, and their inclusion in the community. So the research, Charlie Lakin and Sarah Taub and Roger Stancliff's research is showing that in really small homes, as individualized as possible, people are in the community more and they have more typical routines and rhythms. So some of the NIMBYism may have been, we should have been a little sharper at accepting it as feedback instead of saying, weren't they awful not accepting a group home with 8 and 10 people with disabilities living in it. Lessons learned. 1971, I can only speak for Pennsylvania, which was an early leading state. We were right after Encore, Nebraska. That at the very beginning, well-intentioned, thoughtful people recruited dedicated, committed couples to be live-in house parents. And in the early days, when there were only a handful in a state, they were pretty nice. They felt like real homes to a great extent. As we went to scale and proliferated them, and I can speak to this in the state I worked in Pennsylvania, at the time Pennsylvania went to scale and really appropriated a lot of funds and replicated significantly, the states discontinued all of its training. And the leadership in the department at the time was an economist and believed that if you're buying a service, you should get what you pay for, and that the state had no role in training the private sector. So we proliferated the model with absolutely no vision, no training, no nothing. And 10 years later, woke up at the end of the 80s with a bunch of group homes that were operated like little institutions. And also by then, the Department of Labor had entered the picture, and many of the agencies moved to shift work. So now we had shift work, no vision, no training, and people were flying by the seat of their pants, not consciously managing the environment and the staff and interactions with normalization in mind, but doing it whatever way came natural. And so it was routinized, regimented, without much creativity. And in Pennsylvania, in a number of places, people had to retrace their steps and relook at what they were doing. But I have to say then, as we moved into the 90s and currently, we're beginning to understand that group home has its own challenges, which is that it's rarely somebody's real home. And there is, even with small numbers of people, 2 and 3 and 4, a regimentation and a standardization that creeps in that keeps it from being people's real homes. And so we're hearing people want to have their own home and want self-determination, and people are looking for real life, not simulated life. In the last year, in my role in the agency, my job at the National Association of State DD Directors is to interpret reality for our members, to help them anticipate the future, see where things are going. And one of the first where things are going realities that came clear a couple of years ago was that we can't afford all these beds that we've developed. We can't afford to expand them, and they're not all that great anyway. We hear young families say, I don't want a group home, I want something better than that. So I began talking to our members about the fact that today, close to 60% of the people who get services in our system are living with their families. That's been growing in the last decade, and it continues to grow. Simply the economic reality is we can't afford to replicate group home beds because they're so expensive. So we have subconsciously, not consciously, but subconsciously been building up services to maintain people in their families' homes longer and longer and longer. So we're turning very rapidly into a system that supports people living with their families predominantly. So as I began to explain that to our members and show, thanks to Charlie Lakin's data and analyses, what that evolving picture looks like and predict where it's going, I started asking myself the question, and what might those services look like in families' homes? And as I contemplated this and talked to families, I realized my aha, which I've been sharing with our members as a caution, is that we have institution in our DNA. And most of the leadership in the field has its roots in the institutions, closing them, getting people out and closing them, but nevertheless, that's what we know. And when I contemplate my own career development or evolution, I remember having worked in private institutions and then opening up a little group home with 6 children, adolescents in it. When we opened it in 1974, one of the moms, because 3 of our kids came from their families, even that's problematic, right? We didn't provide enough in-home family support, so families were still giving up their kids, but now to a group home, not an institution. But nevertheless, it was 1974. And one of the moms came in with her little boy and said, I'm going to come every Tuesday and make dinner for everybody. And what I tell everyone in my public speaking is, I remember distinctly as a 24-year-old young professional in the field thinking to myself, why would you do that? I'm in charge now. And resenting that she would do that. Now, where are my roots? I worked in facilities, as many people did, that said to parents, leave your child here for 6 weeks, 6 months, pick the interval, until we, and the words were, break the bonds, and they acclimate to the institution. That was done everywhere. That was done in all these institutions. So I never said those words, but that's in my DNA. I worked in an atmosphere that viewed the necessity of breaking the bond with the family as essential to serving the child. So that was imbued in everything, because kids went home with their parents every other week. The parents picked them up at the door, right? They didn't come into the unit, so that's what I knew. So when I move into the group home, I don't think about it's home for the family too. And I would suggest that most of us have that institutional practice in our DNA, so when we go about setting group homes, it seems to me some of them reverted to institution, because it's all we know. So I start to think, how would our service system look if we never had residential services? If from the get-go, our challenge was how to help families be families. And that's so contrary to the paradigm I've lived in my whole life, I have trouble imagining it. How would it be? How would we relate to families? What would the services look like? What would a real safety net be that families could absolutely count on in the middle of the night at the drop of a hat? And so I think that as we're moving to probably the next 3 decades, I would suggest, are going to rely on families more and more and more and more. The challenge for our state agencies is not to provide family supports only, but to support families. Because we provide in-home services now. We provide something that we call family supports. But when you talk to families, they don't feel supported. And why don't they feel supported? We've lost the emotional connection to them. We've lost the we train case managers to be case managers. We don't teach them family dynamics. We don't teach them how to sit across a kitchen table and say, how can I help you? What would help? We don't teach them what to do when dad walks in the kitchen and says, you dumb schmuck, to his son. We don't train our people who have FaceTime with the families how to manage that really real life and really complex dynamic. How to be an ally for the son or daughter while you're also an ally for the family, and you help them work things out. So I think that the challenge for state DD agencies is to reconceptualize our role, is to reconceptualize services in a relationship with all these families, and not just the families, but their son or daughter, because in the ultimate outcome has got to be that the son or daughter has a life that's theirs, that allows them to be who they are, even while they're relying on their families for support. We are systems that have treated family support as not a Medicaid service, but a non-Medicaid service, and it's basically respite care, maybe family training. We generally, as systems, haven't paid a lot of attention to it because we think we're residential systems, and that's why I keep showing people the data. Now, depending on what your state you're in, you are a residential system. On the average nationally, 58% of the people getting services live with their families, but that varies state to state. Arizona, it's 90%. South Carolina, it's 72%. But go to Mississippi, it's 25%, right? So the states are in varying degrees. But our state director in Arizona, who's got the highest percentage of people in service with their families, was recently involved in our NASD's conference 2 weeks ago. And the entire focus of the conference was how to support families. Barb Brent in Arizona, an old Wolfensberger devotee, had her eyes were opened, and in a state that has committed to supporting families and developed services to supporting families, she said, I got to go back and think about this and kind of rethink some of what we do. And so Barb is my bellwether. I think she's been thinking about it, and certainly her numbers would say they've moved in that direction. And even she is saying, I have to think deeper about how we support families at an emotional level, not just a service level. Things like funding a parent-to-parent network, so they have access to other families for emotional support and to learn from an advocacy that's a small investment of public funds but has a big payoff in terms of whether families feel supported and connected.